Hi, this is Dr. Cesar Oliver with another episode of the Way to College podcast. And actually, today's a continuation of a conversation that we started with Dr. Cristóbal Rodríguez. And when we left off, I asked him in no easy task to give us a snapshot of Latino education, where we're at uh, as it stands given the current administration. And so you talked about the need to build coalitions, to find similarities. Chris, you want to go back to that point, expand on that point? How would you like to move the conversation forward?
Yeah, since we last spoke, uh, uh, much has happened and still happening. And as you know, this current administration has been, for lack of better words, a constant barrage of challenges to both the history of policies that have supported our communities, but also institutions and not just higher education institutions, public institutions overall. And then more specifically as to how it connects to both K-12 and higher education. There's a feeling that in these times that there's definitely um, it's keeping us on our toes, that's for sure. But there's definitely a sense of like, you know, how do we respond? How can we be strategic? What questions about what does this mean for our organizations? What does this mean for how we move the work forward? And so there's a lot to think about and reflect on. I think one of the things that we've seen more specifically recently is legal challenge to HSI designation, which was filed by the state of Tennessee. And this was, soon after the U.S. Department, interestingly enough, um, and I say interesting because it seemed to come out of unanticipated uh, kind of timing where the U.S. Department of Education opened up a call for proposals for funding for aspiring or institutions that are either on the verge emerging HSIs or even HSI funding. And of course, soon after that, you had Tennessee State, which is a very much Southern state, Republican state, who very much has had other challenges. And so I would now get back to why the importance of coalitions is when you look at the timing and the policies and the coordination at some level, and you have to kind of ask, like, there's no coincidence in some of these. There's politics are all connected at some level, and there's a lot of coordination behind the scenes. And so, what does that look like uh, during this time to think about how we address not just, say, a legal threat to the whole HSI designation status and process? What does that mean for our communities, our schools, our families, given everything that we've been seeing regarding this administration's efforts that are very much anti-Latino at some point, um, especially given the numerous cases of profiling against our community with the assumption that they may be legal or undocumented or whatever it may be. Um, we know there is clear evidence of cases and situations where our communities do feel very much up against a wall. And so, what does that mean for how we respond to all of that uh, from a coalition perspective? In in Tennessee, there's a recent history as well that has challenged the HBCU in Tennessee State University, and particularly political challenges and the undermining of Tennessee State's administration when it's come to how they appoint and how they support. Here's a top HBCU in Tennessee, and very much an effort at some level, what I would call is to challenge historical access to communities who have um, historically been underserved by by public institutions or by higher education. And so when we have now an avenue to strengthen specifically the success of our communities through institutions of higher ed, and then there's this situations and histories, uh, we have to kind of come to a place of like, how do we not only do the work, continue to work within ourselves and our communities, and do so strategically, but clearly we have to leverage as to what coalitions we build. And what does that look like across other minority serving institutions? What does it look like for HBCUs? I know that in the current administration, they're still have been supported. There's still a White House initiative for HBCU excellence, whereas we had, in my role with the White House initiative for educational equity, excellence, and economic opportunity for Hispanics, we had created a new White House initiative for HSI specifically, which was both the new when I served in on day one of this administration were undermined it. But one of the things that I've noticed is there's this intentional political play where it's positioning our communities against each other. And at the end of the day, I've always argued, whether in my conversations with my work or with my students, to look at how all of this is a history of systemic challenges. Some would use oppression, where it's going to be like we're all up against a lack of access, a history of limited access, a history of controlling who has access. And with this argument, and this goes back from a legal theory of that, whiteness as property is one article by Cheryl Harris, legal document that really says that there's this assumption that when it comes to education, housing, healthcare, employment, that only a certain group of people should have access to those things, because if anybody else accesses these things, it's a threat on their property, right? And the idea is that as long as we buy into this assumption that there's only so much pie, there's so much, quality education to be had or employment to be had, and we fall into those assumptions, that we're going to easily fall into positioning ourselves against other groups as well. So the politics of division are very much at play with the approach to a lot of what we're up against. And not just in this current administration, it's a history of that. And to counter that is building coalitions, right? Coming together across communities and across minority serving institutions. While they have unique histories, while they've played out uniquely in communities, it's still the same system that we're up against that have limited access and opportunity for our communities and for generations to come. So once we kind of, my argument has been, once we kind of make sense as to how we're up against this whole system, it really puts us in a position to, like, one of the greatest things we need to be doing is building coalitions and doing so strategically. What does that look like when we can really make sense of how we can be a stronger voice united across communities than believing that there's only so much pie to go around when it comes to education or employment or healthcare or housing, right? Those are the historical civil rights movements efforts. And so that stems from that. And I will continuously argue that, when we've seen everything that's playing out now, you can frame them from that perspective that some of that is done through intentional politics of division. And even as we look at how things play out, it's always fascinating how they use these politics of division to be able to, what I would call, distract people from what's actually happening when it comes to certain policies and politics behind the scenes. And what's happening is then there's a lot of undermining going on that not just serve our communities of color, but also serve poor white communities. Poor white communities are going to be hugely impacted by what's being proposed with, this great big policy that of this current administration. And then some would argue at the end of the day, it's poor white communities who are going to be impacted the most by these policy shifts. You look at TRIO programs, for example, that are being threatened and their funding. TRIO programs are incredibly important when it comes to poor white communities, especially in the South. You take away those programs, what does that mean for them? You look at other programs that serve poor communities. And so, it goes back to some of the work that more recently, The Sum of All of Us, that was written a few years ago by an economist, a young Black woman economist who was really pushing for, look, at the end of the day, these politics and these policies undermine all of our access, especially when it comes to poor white communities, communities of color. They intersect across all of our communities. So it's also pushing ourselves to think about what does it look like to even push us further and build coalition with poor white communities. You talk about MLK's the Poor People's March, like had it conceptually thought of very well. Of look, at the end of the day, it is about all of our communities, right? And when we're all at the end of the day more successful, it benefits everybody. Period. This assumption of there's only so much pie to go around is really problematic, and politics division against all of us, right? Not just our communities of color, not just our minority serving institutions, but you think about the history of why we have public institutions, period. And so at another level, what's playing out behind the scenes in the threats to public education, K-12 and higher ed, is there's a threat on public education, K-12 and higher ed, to privatize it, which will limit who has access, which will limit particularly more vulnerable communities or students as well. And so our work has to go beyond just, say, our minority serving institutions. It really has to bridge across all communities, right? Particularly poor communities and communities of color. We have to figure that out. There's histories and moments of where we've done that. And so that's one of the things that I will continue to always push for, is like, look, at the day, we have to build those coalitions to really then think about what does the work look like, right? And, you asked me earlier about my work at Western Michigan University. One of the things that I've appreciated, that we are a predominantly white institution. And when it comes to connecting with families, Black, white, Indigenous, Latina, Asian, at the end of the day, we all have the same hope and aspirations for our children. We all have the same hope and aspirations to transform a generation. Knowing that, I remember being at an event talking to it was actually a parent orientation event, and majority of white parents, and you can tell that coming from low-income communities, are attending a public institution because of the cost that, and because of the challenges that it takes to be able to suddenly access a University of Michigan versus Michigan State versus, say, Western Michigan or Eastern Michigan. There's opportunities and access that are played out for based on the quality of education you've had in K-12, which again takes us back to what does that look like across communities, including white, rural, poor communities as well. And then what can they access? And then the cost of funding, what does that look like? That at the end of the day, when you speak to parents and connect with parents, like, you see the same hope and aspiration. And there's a level of trust that and hope that they have in us to do our job as servants at public institutions. So those things become critically important to be able to connect and to support that aspiration and to take responsibility for the trust they're giving. And sometimes I'll talk about even our work having the sense of academic freedom also comes with a level of academic responsibility for our communities and for the work we're trying to do. So these policies, you bet, are not just a challenge to our Latino, Latinx communities, not just a challenge to our Black communities, Indigenous communities, Asian communities. It's very much a challenge to poor white communities as well, rural communities. It's going to have an influence cut across. When we think about this work, engage with our communities, like we have to also keep that in mind because we're going to quickly lose sight of falling into the politics of division. Right? So that's how I kind of frame some of my work, try to connect the dots, be mindful of that greater picture at the end of the day.
So, well, thank you. And I think it's safe to say, and please correct me, asking, or any of us asking to take a snapshot of Latino education, right? The state of Latino education, it is asking us to look at an incomplete picture because all of the policies as presented that are, that the administration is currently trying to put forth really, again, cut across all of our, these groups,
Yeah.
and particularly groups that have historically have had difficulty accessing not just higher education, but quality public education as well. And so it sounds like all of that is at risk um, for a number of groups. Chris, this is important work. This is heavy work. As a side note, I I think if you unless you, and please, feel free to correct me. I feel like if you don't work in education, it's difficult to truly understand, right? So from a parent, even from a student perspective, if I think about my own experience, I remember coming up even through in the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas. Um, I didn't understand how education worked until I got to college and I was taking courses and talking about having conversations about inequality and about access and then even deepening that understanding as I worked in higher ed and then working in public education and working as a school board member. And so it is complex, right? There is a history that is very important, I think, in understanding the state of education and understanding who has had access, who has not had access, how difficult it has been for groups to access, right, education. Um, so how do we how do we educate the uneducated? How do we provide perspective to groups who or to people not in education?
You know, education is one of the most powerful tools. We know this, right? That shapes and informs communities, culture, society. We've heard these words through our throughout our learning of education, uh, and they very much hold true. So any politician running for office has to have an education platform because everybody's eager to know what's their goal. Sadly, most don't have an inkling even of the history and purpose and the challenges historically to access, and yet believe to assume through their own political gain that they're going to shape, improve education, right? A silver bullet solution for an education system that they will argue that is failing. And at some level, it's because we have worked hard to improve public education, to make it accessible for all, to make it accessible for poor communities, to make it accessible for Black and Brown, Latino, Indigenous, Asian, um, and when you look at some of these policies and the politics they're using, yeah, it hurts all of us at the end of the day. And I mentioned the Sum of Us. I call it the Sum of All of Us, but it's the Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. Uh, and it's subtitled "What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together." we approach education policy and how it's undermining public education access for and fair access, right? It's not just thinking about communities of color, but we think about then our students with disabilities, students who do come from realities are that a system has not been set up well for them. So the most marginalized will be further marginalized. So when we approach some of this work, it's thinking of how do we make sure that we teach education. You know, at some point I've had these ideas of like, wouldn't it be great that as part of high school curriculum to shape, I know we teach like a government class or everybody takes the US government course in high school, but I think they should also take an education class, a history of education, right? Students should know as to why they're getting educated and how they're getting educated, right? They're the most impacted by federal policy and or state policies in education, right? They are the main constituent, and they should also have an understanding as to how their future is going to be impacted by policies. So when I think about certain policies and how they're developed, and that doesn't even include the realities of students, much less, especially the most marginalized student communities. But when I think about it, doesn't include the voices and the perspective and expertise of educators sometimes, but it sure does take into consideration the perspective of a publishing company who has interest in more testing and more curriculum that is purchased from them, whether it's books or curriculum for teachers and what and how they can teach. Take, for example, I think Common Core standards that was adopted at some point up to 46 states. I think a few states have gone away with that. There's an interesting dynamic when we look at the data that since 2014 across the US and institutions of public higher education, we've seen achievement levels drop. And when I've asked colleagues who have worked both in K-12 and higher ed as to what do they think makes sense as to why they've had a drop in retention or an increase in the lack of preparation to be college ready, or a decrease in students being less interested in college. For some reason, all that points to 2014 when most states had began to implement the Common Core state standards, a curriculum that did not provide any preparation for teachers on how to transition, did not provide teachers the tools to be able to learn how to adapt appropriately to be culturally responsive to our communities or linguistically responsive, or even think about being inclusive for students with disabilities. And still today is a challenge in its implementation. And we see just that drop at a number of levels. And folks will say, yeah, we think Common Core really played a huge role in that drop. This was not federal policy, but it was a state by state, what I would call hostile takeover, implementation of policy that at the end of the day has had a huge influence on the success and future of children. Now, why shouldn't students have a say so in that policy conversation? And the only way to do that is, yeah, we have to teach our K-12 schools should be part of the curriculum to at least basically understand why and the how of their public education. So that when it comes to them playing a role in the future, making decisions for their own children or their own communities, they can at least make a more informed one and not just one based on because somebody up in some political space or someone who's given them money is telling them that this is what they have to do. I used to teach an undergraduate course on educational leadership, and I would tell them, believe that at some level you will play a leadership role as a parent, as a community leader, maybe elected official would be great, or even as someone who's in business. Given how the tax systems are across states, given how there are going to be decisions being made on the education of someone at some point in their lives, they said you have to make sure that you are informed that you use evidence, that you use at least this effort and process to be informed and make an informed decision, whether it's on the future of your own children or the future in the community. Why not shouldn't our kids, our students from a K-12 perspective have at least a more informed understanding of how they're getting educated and why they're getting educated a certain way, right? And at the same time, I would argue that if we did that, we probably wouldn't have a teacher shortage. We probably value to a greater degree the role of educators and teachers. Instead, we do face some challenges in public education. That's a shortage of teachers, especially when it comes to teachers who are part of the solution to our communities, to all of our communities that are underserved, that are marginalized. So I think that would be a silver bullet solution. I'm always criticizing that because everybody always has one.
Yeah.
But it's going to take more than just one solution. It has to take a number of things. But I would say I think a big step would be to have a more informed citizenry
Mm-hmm.
would also give us a much stronger, healthier democracy. Right? There's a relationship and then to how we respond to the challenges we're seeing today politically. That quickly then also informs voting and being an active citizen, an informed citizen, and not just believing the hype that some news station is giving you or some pundit is saying, or because someone got paid to say something. No, we really have to push ourselves as a community, as a society, to be better informed. And it's not just about being informed on, can you name, what we call the banking of education, like name this and name that and what's this, like it's not just these certain facts you have to know. You have to have that level of critical thinking, of understanding concepts, understanding why we have public education to begin with. What is in it for the public good? How is education a public good? And what responsibility comes with all that? So I think there are things that we can do better as a community, as a society, and as a nation. And at the same time, not just for a sense of like, as a nation, citizenry, but global citizens as well. We need to build better humans, build better global citizens, because there's a lot at stake globally and a lot happening right now at the end of the day.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. But the picture that you're painting for us and the solutions that you're recommending um, paints a difficult road moving forward. It's going to be challenging. I think for those of us that have always been in the work, you that have been in the work that has defined, I think, your professional career, it's always been somewhat difficult. No?
Yeah.
As you move forward and as you look forward, what gives you hope, Chris?
One of the things that I've appreciated is the time that I do get to spend with students, hearing their stories, hearing the stories of their families, their sacrifices of their families. I appreciate also celebrating with them moments that you can, especially, easiest one is at commencement, graduation ceremonies. Those are always the best to feel like this is the reason. This is why we do what we do. When you begin to see the sacrifice that families have made for the education of their children, when you begin to recognize all that it's taken to achieve generational opportunity, right? To transform a generation moving forward, because now you have an educated family. And for Latino communities, we one of the probably most powerful tools for our communities is education. So when we get to that moment, and when you go to graduation ceremony, when you see the familias, those are the snapshots of achieving the dream, right? Achieving these aspirations and goals that they've set out to transform a generation, transform our communities, to be solutions to our communities. And that cuts across communities of color, cuts across white communities as well. Like, we have to recognize that, when we send our students to college for an education, it's with the hopes and aspirations and sacrifices that families have made and their generations before them have made. Right? They come with rich stories. So when you get a chance to hear their stories, where they're from, even it's not just from the even U.S. context, talking to our international students as well, hearing their stories and what they're trying to achieve and what they're setting out to do across disciplines, right? Their solutions to a next generation that needs them as well to be educated, to a better, stronger, informed society. So for me, those moments is what gives me like hope as well. Even when there's struggles and times and spaces where things look grim. We've seen a lot of protests in LA, and then we see this filing on the HSI against the HSI designation, Hispanic Service Institution designation process. We see what's playing out globally, and it's hard to not be to lose hope, and it's hard to not fall into like, okay, why should we do any of this? But I had this conversation recently with one of my daughters, and who's getting ready to study abroad, and I said, having an experience to also think globally is probably one of the best things one can ever do. It gives you an idea as to what the need is for us as people globally, and for societies and cultures, and our sense of responsibility to each other. I said, even amidst in my own experience in studying abroad, going into the history of Germany, going into the history of how does one reconcile a past where there has been genocide? How do we move forward from such histories? And not just thinking from the German context, from the sense of genocide. There's a level of genocide playing out today. There's a level of genocide that has played out across our communities. When you think about it, historically, indigenous communities, Black communities, right? There's definitely genocide that's played on Asian communities. So what is our quest for? And it's you arrive quickly as to the things that give us hope is believing that things can be better one day and will be better one day. But it's thinking that this serious existential question as to, okay, so what's our role? What do we do? How do we keep growing and improving ourselves and taking care of ourselves so that we can be part of a solution for our communities moving forward? You have to believe in that. So in that process of even having this engagement with my colleagues, we've recently been having conversations through our association, the American Association for Hispanics in Higher Ed, and saying, well, what wisdom do we provide? What vision do we give them? What is it that we can share that will not just address that, but there's a sense of that we are in tumultuous times. What hope do we share at the same time? Because we have to share hope, right? Because hope is powerful, right? In Star Wars lately, we've been seeing how hope is what sparks a revolution or rebellion, right? And I really appreciated thinking about what does that mean when you have these moments of hope, and to believe that we can move towards better situations. Yeah, it becomes powerful, because then that's what you move towards. That's a guiding light.
Mm-hmm.
That's a source of energy. Gives us the why when we need it. So we have to think about what's our responsibility as leaders to ensure that despite the challenges, despite that we have much to reconcile, despite what's happening in the world sometimes, we still have to be a beacon of hope and light, right? We still have to move towards believing that what we're doing today are planting seeds for tomorrow. Right? So those I think are critically important. It's having that constant reflection and being reminded back when you connect to these moments of graduation, connection with students, connection with communities, familias, about the why, right? And being able to say, this is why we do what we do, right? Um, because those are transformational, critical moments in life, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Chris, thank you. Thank you for those thoughts. I think, I think if you spend any time on social media or watching the news and talking to educators, talking to administrators, the picture, I think there's fear, there's concern. And so I think just as you've shared, right? Sharing those moments, for sharing the moments of success, right? The moments that are of success from family and from students, and the hope and the expectation almost that we are planting seeds, right? Of hope, I think is really powerful, and and I think necessary. I think we needed to hear that as we transition out. Chris, I would love for you to tell, what do you say to a student who finds themselves looking at maybe entering higher ed, maybe the high school student who is looking forward and trying to figure out what's next for themselves, but they see sort of the landscape. What advice do you give them?
Yeah, as you say that, I have to acknowledge that a lot of our students have this level of fear, almost traumatized at the idea of, you know, of everything that's going on, and what hope do they have? What aspirations could they have and so I think um, that message of hope as to what they do for themselves is part of the dreams and aspirations that not just their families have had for them, but the generations before them, um, and that it's all a process, right? Not that it's this idea like you're carrying all of this weight now, and you have to take great responsibility in carrying all this weight. But the idea is investing in their growth, and their reflection, and their time to enjoy the process is the best thing that we any of us can do for ourselves. Thinking about what shapes us down the road, and that's not just the idea that it's just this education, this degree, but it's also in how they shape their worldviews, how they shaped their role in society, how they shape uh, the role and what they're going to do down the road. I'm believing that a lot of that is also relational. Right? What relationships they invest on as as organizations or communities or familial, whatever it may be, like that's part of the college experience, right? It's a little bit of all these things that will play a role in shaping one for a greater future society, right? Whatever discipline you may go into, engineering or sociology or education, uh, or even engineering technology, whatever it may be. All these things, like at the end of the day, um, are playing a role in providing a service to our communities, and at the end of the day, really reflect the hopes and aspirations and dreams that those before us have had. But at the same time, it's part of our own dreams and aspirations, with the idea that we will grow along the way, we will pivot along the way. When I started college, I thought I wanted to be a pharmacist, and realizing that there was a big part of me that I always enjoyed my time of service, doing community service, doing whether it's through the Boy Scouts that I was in or through my fraternity that I was in, realizing like, okay, I think my calling is serving and being out in schools and community, knowing that that was giving me a level of satisfaction and joy, that I pivoted and then said, okay, I think my calling is here as an education. And that led to other rich experiences that really were transformational and that led me down to where I am today. It's all a process, right? And only by going through taking those first steps, committing to yourself, committing to your growth, committing to your future success and aspirations is as much of important as ensuring that we fulfill the dreams and aspirations of our families and our communities, right? And believing that we're part of all of it. So those things are important. And the idea is enjoy those relationships, enjoying that time to invest in yourself and your own growth. Because that's the time to do it. That's when you're making sense of the world. That's where you're making sense of who you are, right? That's where we see folks suddenly find a better meaning or stronger meaning of their own cultural identity. Um, my youngest one said, like I would love to go to a college that has ballet folklorico. And I did ballet folklorico when I was an undergraduate student because it played a huge role in shaping my own cultural identity, right? Investing in myself to enjoy something like, yeah, I like to dance, but at the same time, learning the histories of culture through, and we had a whole model with the dance group. It was educación y cultura a través de la danza, right? Education and culture through dance. And that education component was huge, but it also shaped my own identity, right? And that's what you do at that age when you go to college. You invest in yourself to shape and enrich in yourself and explore and to be informed and to think of that as a constant process that you should continuously grow and reflect, right? And think about yourself in the world. Right? And that's what a college education aspires to do. And you look at our university visions and missions across anywhere, you will see that, right? To create informed citizenry, to approach holistically the success for communities and families and individuals, to contribute to a society that is going to be enriched by the roads that a university achieves and through its students, right? So all these things are very much connected, and we should think about what does that look like, and invest in that time in ourselves to grow, reflect, pivot, and go through the process of exploration, right? And moving towards the process of shaping your identity, where you see yourself in the world, where you define your meaning in life. Those are big concepts, but important process that you go through when you're going through those stages of growth and reflection.
Chris, thank you. Thank you for leaving us with those words. I hope. No, I think the words will inspire others. I think for students who find themselves maybe lost or thinking about what do I have to look forward to, and how should I move forward, I think you've given them plenty to think about, and I think plenty to look forward to. Um, and I know certainly a lot of your words certainly echoed with my own experience as an undergrad. So thank you.
Thank you
Um,
for creating this time and space and for doing all of this. We don't spend enough time having these deep thinking conversations and sharing that wisdom with our community, or sharing that wisdom with especially our next generation. Thank you,
I
man.
appreciate. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And it's funny you mentioned that. So many years ago, maybe about 15 years ago, I uh I met with a gentleman here in the valley, and he had um he was an alum, and so we got together because he said I was trying to get an alumni organization started in the valley, and he talked about that space, and he said in college, again, I think maybe this is a um really connecting to what the advice that you've given students. But he said in college, you have these great conversations. And he says, and then it's really hard to find the space to have those conversations after you graduate. And so here he was about 20 years removed from his undergrad, and he said, I'm still trying to find that space, man. And so if this podcast can be a space for that, I know for me, I look forward to these conversations, because I think I definitely understood where he was coming from, because I think I was feeling the same thing. I was only 5, 6 years removed from my undergrad experience, but moving forward, I know exactly what he meant, and so yeah, that I know it's not lost on me. So thank you.
Yeah, it's important work. So keep it going. Anything I can do to serve, not just the work that you're doing here, but I think support each other, support our communities. It's a blessing to be of service. So let me know how I can serve anytime.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Thank you, Chris. This concludes another episode of the Way to College podcast. Thank you to my guests. Thank you to our listeners and viewers out there. Please remember to subscribe, rate, follow, all of that stuff that we're all used to now. But I think more importantly, please share the podcast with one other person. Uh, I'd appreciate that. Thank you, and we'll talk again soon. Bye bye.
Gracias.